Hello, and I'm going to do another update on the war in Ukraine. And the situation continues to escalate. First, we'll look at what's happening on the battlefield. Let's go to Severodonetsk, which is a city on the eastern portion of Ukraine. This city has been taken almost completely by the Russians, except for a factory called the Azot factory. There are reportedly up to several thousand Ukrainian and foreign mercenaries held up there. Unfortunately, they have taken at least 500 civilians as part of a human shield. Now, the Russians were trying to work out an escape corridor for the civilians as a passage to safety, but the Ukrainians did not oblige. Other areas of the line, there are rocket and artillery attacks being carried out by the Ukrainian artillery on the city of Donetsk. And actually, this is the most intense shelling throughout the entire conflict, and it upwards to 300 shells in a couple hours. So there has been some media attention now being placed upon this shelling. I think this is one of the few times it's actually come out, despite being throughout this entire conflict. So the West, the people in the West are starting to see, what's been happening there for the first time. And I think that this is a sort of turning point in some of this propaganda that's been happening in this war, where Ukraine has always been painted as sort of, the good guy and fighting for democracy, and we're behind you, the troops and all this. And now you're starting to see, the people in the West are starting to see, some of these atrocities that the Ukrainian army have been carrying out. Keep in mind, a lot of the atrocities, like the mistreatment of the POWs and so on, have been pretty much swept under the carpet and kept from the view of most Western viewers. Now, looking at other areas of the front, we have the Ukrainians trying to do some counterattacks. And it appears that these counterattacks are being done to pull attention away from the areas of the front of the Ukrainian army that are in dire straits. The Ukrainian army is noted to be losing upward to 1,000 troops on their front lines every day, and upwards to 20,000 per month. Now, I consider these to be highly underestimated numbers. You have, if you would include, surrendering troops, wounded troops, and fleeing troops, which obviously they're not including in these numbers, I would say we're probably closer to about 2,000 per day. And I'm basing my numbers on, the intel that I'm getting, which has so far been a lot more accurate than what you're being told in the mainstream media. And I believe that we're looking at upwards to 30 to 40,000 casualties every month. So it's a dire situation for the Ukrainian army, and this is why I think it's quite, horrendous that they're concentrating all their, artillery on the civilians of Donetsk, and rather not to assist their troops on the front line. So this is where those 155 millimeter American howitzers went over to the Donetsk area. Now, in other news, we have air raid sirens, going off all throughout the provinces of Ukraine at night. We have reportedly missile and aviation strikes throughout all Ukraine. So you can see this war is not letting up in any sense. In fact, targets in Kiev, Odessa are being hit. So looking at some other things going on here, we've got the Guardian, I believe, it's a British newspaper, came out with some numbers on the Russian artillery mismatch, where we're looking at 20 to 1 advantage to Russia and a 40 to 1 with the ammunition. Keep in mind, artillery is only as good as the ammunition that you got. Now, interestingly, all these mainstream media, newspapers and, cable news and so on, and have always touted, the Ukrainians winning, every day. That's all you heard. And now the narrative is switching over to, Ukraine is losing and collapsing. Now, keep in mind, this all started with the Washington Post article that came out, interesting, right after, they voted for the massive aid package. And I pointed out, the reason why was they didn't want that released until after they approved that package, because no one's going to approve a $40 billion aid package to a country whose lines are collapsing. So you can see everything's all manipulated on the West. So anyway, you've got this narrative change going on. And my theory is that, they tried the Ukrainian winning thing, and it was successful, and then it got all the funds, fleeced from, the populations and being transferred over to, Ukraine and into the pockets of the military industrial complex. And a lot of this is going to be dark money, and it's going, to slush funds and offshore accounts that we'll never, ever see again. So in that sense, the objective was met. Okay. Now, otherwise it didn't work so well. So now they're switching it over to this new narrative, which is going to be a sympathy narrative, the victim narrative, for Ukraine, that they're horribly outmatched and they're in dire straits. They need your help terribly. Okay. Before you had the winning, narrative because you wanted to get everyone's morale up and you wanted to get everyone on board with Ukraine, because who wants to be on board with the loser, right? So you can see how, they're playing public opinion, and this is what the West does. It's their strategy. It's a very propaganda-oriented media. And now they're switching up the narrative. So you always have to ask, why are they switching these narratives up? It's all strategy. So anyway, you've got some news coming out of Europe. You've got Russia cutting its gas imports into Germany, in particular, of up to 40%. Now that's devastating. And also you've got this LNG export facility in the United States, which is down after a fire. And this is up to 20% of the LNG exporting capacity of the United States. So these two factors combine together for an unmeasurable effect on the German economy. Now, the reasons the Russians gave for cutting that gas down was that I heard one report that had something to do with this facility that Germany annexed of Russian. It was like a Gazprom satellite company, and they basically just annexed its facilities. And that, plus the fact that there's some issues with the pumping system, and what to believe, we don't, the end result is you got 40% less gas. So a German minister came out of one of their economic ministries, and said that this is going to have an extreme effect on the people of Germany as well as their economy, that people are going to end up being very cold this winter. It's going to affect on landlords. It's going to affect on bankruptcies, untold devastation to their economy. It was a very dire warning. So another thing you had going on is that the leaders of Italy, France, and Germany, Macron and Draghi and the Chancellor of Germany, went personally to Kiev to visit with Zelensky. This is a very interesting visit, and I believe it was under the guise of this EU membership thing. Okay, now the whole idea of Ukraine ever getting into the EU is just utterly ridiculous. This is one of the most corrupt nations on earth. And, it's like if you look up corrupt countries, you're going to see Ukraine in the top one or two or three, it depends on what source, but it's up there. It is a puppet state of the United States. I mean, look what the Bidens did. You know, they were over there wheeling and dealing, and they made a fortune. You know, that was all money taken from the United States taxpayers and the Ukrainian people. Okay, this is just how it is in Ukraine. It's drug infested, corrupt. It's full of corrupt oligarchs. The entire military is infested with corruption. It's a one-party system under Zelensky. It's basically a dictatorship with neo-Nazi factions running around. Okay, this is what Ukraine is. So why would you allow a country in the midst of a war into the EU? It's literally laughable. Okay, so there was some whispers on this whole visit that the real meeting was about kind of trying to negotiate with Zelensky on being open to having talks with Russia, and that he's probably going to have to cede territory. Now, the whole thing with the ceding territory, why I believe this is so critical, like why, especially like Ukraine doesn't want to be seen as ceding territory, it's basically admitting defeat. Now, you have to look at the big picture here. Zelensky was snookered into this war. All right, they were offering this NATO membership, and this was all a lie. There was no way Ukraine was ever going to be part of NATO. And you can see like videos of like there's some ambassador workers and State Department officials that were being interviewed, and they were basically just like laughing at that whole idea and claiming this is just like kind of like the way you play the politics and, you know, like that kind of thing. And it was actually really insulting to Ukraine, because it really brought home the fact that that was all just a lie. And it was done because they wanted to get Putin to attack Ukraine. Okay, that's what it was all about. Even Kamala Harris was played. She was part of all that. So it was all a scam to, instigate this war, because everyone knew that, there was no way Russia was going to allow Ukraine into NATO. Okay, and Zelensky really believed that. Now keep in mind, Zelensky's got no education. He's a drug addict, and he's an actor, a comedian. Okay, and that's why he was selected, because he's a tool. Just the same way Biden was selected. Biden never had a shot at ever being president. He tried like so many times in his career, but obviously everyone knows he's incompetent. And in fact, 50% of Americans in a recent poll claimed that they thought Biden was incompetent. Okay, he's end-stage dementia. He was selected because of this. They need someone to play, and you can't have a, Donald Trump, in there running things, and think you're going to be able to play Donald Trump. It ain't going to work. It was actually played to some extent, but Biden was a tool, and so was Zelensky, and so is Kamala Harris. These people are all selected for this purpose, okay? And, the goal of these people was to have a war with Russia. It was USA versus Russia. USA actually attacking Russia, even though Russia was enticed into Ukraine, and everyone in the world thinks, it was attack by Russia. It was actually more the other way around if you look at how this whole thing played out, going back to 2014 with the coup attempt by the United States. Well, successful coup. So anyway, we have these European leaders in Kiev trying to convince Zelensky that to end this is really the way we're going to look at this. He was being put under pressure to end this war, okay? And the reason why these European leaders are doing this is Europe is collapsing. It's in complete collapse right now. And this is just beginning. Just wait until, like another year, with this. Look at the gas prices. They soared on the last 2 bit of news I told you. This is a horrendous situation, especially for like Germany, which, its whole economy is just going to go into a freeze. And you're going to start getting all these like exits, like Italy exits, and you had the Brexit, and you're going to have discontent just going all over Europe. You're going to have, remember the, the yellow vest movement and everything. I mean, think of the reasons that they did those protests. Imagine what they're going to be protesting like in a year. It's going to be unreal. And you're going to have economic implosions going on. Think about Spain and Greece and everything. It's just going to get so ugly. And these leaders, they see this, and I think now they're starting to realize that they were duped by the Biden administration into this whole thing. That in the beginning they could have worked something out with Russia. I think now they're starting to realize that was what they should have been doing, sitting down at a negotiation table and talking. But instead they kind of got all whipped up in the frenzy, and they were convinced. They didn't think about any of the consequences of their actions, and they were just the little chihuahuas that were barking at Biden's heels. And now they're realizing that they were played as well. So many leaders on the West were literally just played by this cabal that's running things. This is all a ruse, okay? To get at Russia, and they had to play all these leaders, and they did it. And it was actually a very slick production. And it's all playing, off of emotions and everything. And they know how to play a propaganda war. They're really good at it. But the thing is with this propaganda, it's never really long lasting. It's only good for a short term. It tends to backfire and have lots of blowback in the longer term. Because for one, it's not real. Propaganda is basically lies, right? So if you're telling people lies and eventually things start getting discovered, then there's going to be a blowback. And you're seeing that now in Germany. Where, first of all, the Ukrainian migrants are causing so much problems in Europe, especially Eastern Europe. And then you've got, now you've actually got protest. Remember in the beginning it was all these pro-Ukrainian protests everywhere? Well, now it's flipping around, and now you're actually having pro-Russian protests everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but in a lot of places. Like in Germany, there was a video of this pro-Russian protest, and at first I started watching it. It was a little ways into it, I'm thinking, oh, this is going to end pretty soon. It kept on going and going and going. There was no end. The video ended before the protest. They were marching, and it must have been thousands and thousands of people. Now, that was unheard of 3 months ago. Okay, so you're having this change of sentiment in Europe, and I think it's because the propaganda is being exposed, and people, they're starting to get conflicting, information. Like I was saying about how the shelling of Donetsk. People are seeing that and they're going, well, maybe Zelensky isn't the good guy. And then they start Googling, Zelensky. And then they start, they see the video of Zelensky high on drugs, spinning around in his chair and stuff. They go, well, this guy's not a leader. And then he realize he's a comedian and blah, blah, blah. And, and the Arestovich character, is throwing F-bombs out. And people start looking, this is the gangster regime. And people start hearing about the neo-Nazi stuff. And I'm telling you, this whole narrative collapses. And this is happening throughout the whole world. Now, in places where you have more free press, which is not the United States and not Europe, it's actually kind of funny because they call it free world, but they're actually probably very far from that. Especially the press, the media. Where you had India and other countries, I think they quickly kind of size things up, and they realized that they didn't want any part of this propaganda ploy that was going on. So I think these European leaders, they look at places like India, which is getting cheap oil, from Russia now, and they're doing fairly well economically compared to the European countries. They're being, decimated from all these sanctions that backfired. And, they originally thought that they were going to be like rock stars. Biden was going to be a hero as, Russia collapsed and Putin was crawling on his knees and Russia had to, surrender. And I mean, this is what they thought. And the people who study Russia and they know about what's going on in this war, this is so utterly ridiculous. And you could tell that these sanctions had no thought of the consequences. And this is in spite, of experts coming out and warning of global recession, famine, and energy, a crisis. Now, what do we have now? We have a global recession. We have, the IMF keeps on lowering the global GDP. Okay, we have the energy crisis, and we have famine. Now, were these experts using crystal balls, or did they just look at facts? Okay, so everything was there to, if you looked at it, that you could kind of figure out how this is all going to play out. And this is where all these European countries, they just kind of jumped right on, and now they're going to be suffering politically, and their the well-being of their citizens is going to be really degraded. There's going to be a lot of harsh blowback, and leaders like Macron narrowly escaped a political loss to Marine Le Pen. So the situation is dire. They may lose the EU. So the whole idea of even bringing Ukraine into the EU is laughable. But even more importantly, will the EU survive this? That's how bad this is. The EU may not survive. If one more big country like France exits or Italy exits, do you think the EU is even going to survive? Or is it going to end up being just like some factions of nations? This whole war could actually not just be about Ukraine, but could be the economic future of Europe. The loss of the EU. Think how huge that is. And that's a very, very real possibility. And I think this is why you have Macron, especially you see his rhetoric had changed so much since this war. And he realizes that politically, this is a hot potato. You don't want to be holding this. You want to get out of this. That they need to have peace in Europe. Otherwise, the EU is finished. Okay? Now, like France and Germany are like the backbones to the EU more than any other country. So either one of those goes down, EU's finished in my opinion. Okay? So this is one of the things that I think a lot of people are not looking at is like the future of the EU and how momentous this whole thing is involving, the EU. Okay, so moving on to some other things. Now, I want to kind of go over to, the escalations, the ones that were existing and some newer ones. So looking at, one of my top escalations has always been, Finland and Sweden trying to fast track them into NATO. Okay, and you had Turkey blocking it. Now, if you recall, Turkey had sort of like a reason that's probably not necessarily, true. It was basically saying that, Sweden and Finland were somehow involved with some kind of terrorist funding and so on. And I think that was more just done as an excuse to keep them out, because Turkey knows that they go into NATO, it's really Finland, then that's going to escalate this war, because Russia will never allow Finland into NATO and never allow them to have like missiles or nuclear weapons in their country. That's just not going to happen. Okay, and Turkey knows this. Now, I think Turkey is being very sneaky here. Turkey, and you think back like during the Middle East, they played, the conflict with Syria. They kind of always played both sides pretty well. They're sneaky that way. Turkey is in a really bad situation. They need this war to end. They have rampant inflation. There's going to be a lot of problems domestically for Erdogan if he can't control that. Now, he sees that he needs the economic ties with Russia. They both share the Black Sea. They have a lot of, Russians are always coming down on vacation and so on. They have commerce. They buy military hardware from Russia, like the S-400 system. So Turkey has a vested interest to preserve relations with Russia and to also end the war. So you can see that where they hosted that summit where, Turkey was trying to bring both sides together and have them work out something, and that didn't work. But Turkey also, I believe, is working on behalf of Russia to block Finland and Sweden. Now, this is big, and I think a lot of people are missing that, because this really the excuse about this terrorist funding thing is so minuscule compared to the big picture that there's something else to it. Now, keep in mind, even after there is some concessions about trying to work out some of those issues, Finland and Sweden still are trying to get it fast tracked in. Turkey again put his foot down and said, no, it's not going to happen. Paraphrasing. So NATO, was also saying that they wanted to, try to negotiate with Turkey, to see if they can get them to, relinquish that, that veto. And Turkey's been sticking to that. And that tells me there's something more to this. And I believe that Turkey is working with Russia because they don't want this war to escalate, for one. Now, again, there was another situation where Turkey intervened on behalf of Russia. And that is this whole notion that I believe Boris Johnson of England wanted to, with the EU, bring a NATO fleet into the Black Sea, confront the Russian fleet. I mean, can you imagine this? Can you imagine World War III? Imagine a NATO ship gets sunk. I mean, how is that going to play out? You know the answer. So, the whole ruse behind this was that NATO wanted to open up a port so they could ship out grain from Ukraine. That they had to do that. Rail cars not it's so lame-brained, and the escalation of in this is just like off the charts. And again, it goes back to the West trying to escalate this war at any cost. Now, if you really wanted to end this war, you would want to sit down and negotiate it out, right? I mean, this is how they did, the Cuban Missile Crisis and everything. What happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Both sides, or one side, it's all you take, just one side to say no, like the United States is doing, and say, no, we're not going to talk. Well, what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Well, you can use your imagination, right? This is way worse. And you have, basically, Ukraine's not even allowed in the negotiation party. Supposedly the only ones now that are in the negotiation party for Ukraine's future is Britain, France, Germany, and the United States. Okay, Ukraine's not allowed. I mean, just think how eye-opening that is. Well, for one, it shows you that Ukraine is a puppet state of the United States. It's not allowed to make real decisions. and that the United States does not want to see an end to this conflict because the United States is blocking those negotiations. So it's in the negotiating party to block the negotiations. Whereas like France and Germany and so on really want to end this thing because they need this to end for their, their future, the viability of their nations. It's at stake in the EU. Okay, so you see that the whole thing here is for really you have to say the United States. It's like a war between the United States and Russia, and all these other countries are collateral damage. Europe is like the biggest collateral damage in this, other than Ukraine, obviously. Ukraine is just like cannon fodder. It's really an atrocity how Ukraine is being thrown under the bus on this, and everyone's like clamoring about fighting for democracy and everything, and they're literally fighting to the last Ukrainian. And this is actually one of the complaints of the POWs when they get captured from Ukraine, is that they feel like they're being taken advantage of in this wars between NATO and the United States and so on, and they're basically being thrown into front lines as cannon fodder. You're going to hear that over and over again if you watch the interviews of the Ukrainian POWs. So everyone kind of knows that in Ukraine. It's just the rest of the world, who's sticking by, the Biden, narrative. And back to the Black Sea and that whole thing with the NATO fleet. Since when does NATO ever give a damn about famine? Look at all the wars NATO causes. Look at the war in Yemen. Basically they're sanctioning that war and providing all the armaments and the the missiles and attack aircraft to do that war. Okay, and that's not even the biggest. I mean, you could look Syria and Libya, and it goes on and on. Afghanistan, Iraq, I could go on for the next couple minutes. Well, Latin America. Does NATO, United States, ever give a damn, a rat's ass, about famine? Ever? Well, you know the answer. So that whole thing was a ruse, and it was really all about NATO. Well, the United States, they want to grab a port in Ukraine, and they want to make it a NATO port so that they can ship arms in. That's all it's about. They want Odessa. They want Odessa's port. That's really what they want. And, they would want to put some NATO troops there maybe, or send in some other peacekeeper type, under the ruse of, this white helmet kind of thing, or, can you let your mind, think of all the possibilities that the West would do with that scenario? All extremely escalatory. Okay, now the escalations are similar. An analogy to me is like you got the 16-year-old kid at the poker table, and he's trying to bluff away against seasoned professionals. That's what it looks like to me. Like all these kind of ruses and so on, these are all done. These things like on the fly. These are horrendous. There's no thinking of consequences. Like, who would bring this whole thing to the brink of a nuclear war? Like, without analyzing things clearly. They're not. There's no way you can convince me that these kind of moves are being done for the people of Europe or Ukraine. These are being done to escalate this war and bring this region to a World War III. That's the reality. And you really think that Russia's going to back down on any of these things? Of course not. So what does that mean? If Russia's not going to back down and this inexperienced poker player keeps on bluffing away, what's going to happen? Okay? Now, is this being done by design? Just like when you look at like the Biden cabal's domestic agenda. I mean, look at disaster after disaster after disaster. Is that being done by design? Or again, is this just horrible decisions without thinking of any consequences? I think that's what they want you to think. Again, we don't know who's really running things because we know Biden's like completely incompetent. He's got end-stage dementia. He's just like Zelensky's. He's a tool. So is Kamala Harris. So the ones who are really running this show, we don't know who they are. So we don't know their their motives. Are they like complete psychopaths? Or are they just like really bad, like decision makers with no, thought of consequences to anything? Because their complete domestic agenda is an utter disaster. And not only that, the thing that makes me really, and it's scary to think that this is being done by design, is think about this. If you were making bad decisions, now we have so many bad decisions to pick from. Has there been any of these that they reversed back? Now, this is a very important concept. If they reversed some things back and took steps backwards to alleviate the problem, then you could probably infer that, oh, maybe they made some bad decisions and now they're trying to rectify them. Or have they doubled down on every single thing that's gone wrong? And we're talking a lot of double downs. Okay, now what does that tell you if somebody's doubling down on stupid? Are they really stupid? Or are they doing this by design? Okay, now if this is being done by design, this is very, very dangerous. And you can see why this is also escalatory. Now, keep in mind, you've also got people like this military industrial complex running things, like the Mitt Romney and this Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. These are like the mouthpieces of this, MIC faction in this lobby. They're very powerful. And then this is all in on this $40 billion, aid package. And this is why they didn't want people to know that Ukraine was collapsing and losing. That's why they had the Washington Post holding off on all that news, because they had that article ready to go about Ukraine basically collapsing. And then of course right after that you had the New York Times. Now they did a narrative switch. So before it was all about Ukraine winning, and this is to get, for one, it had dual purpose. One is because you need the funding. You're not going to fund an army that's collapsing, right? It's like ridiculous. So they needed that narrative to be that the Ukraine was winning so they could get all those arms deals done. Okay, that was the object number one. Now, object number two was you want to get people all rally behind Ukraine. So if Ukraine is losing horribly, people don't want to be on the side of a loser. I mean, we're looking at Joe's six-pack here. We want Joe's six-pack to be like he's rooting for a football team. Like if your football team is 0-10 already, you're not going to be much of a fan, are you? So you see how this all plays. It's all on emotions, and it's about basically manipulating people. So now they're flipping the narrative over to the victim. Ukraine is losing horribly. They need our help. It's a sympathy thing. It's about this poor victim. Okay, and so how does this all play? How is this? What's their motive? Their goals and all of this. And okay, think about if somebody's a victim and they're being taken advantage of, or however you want to look at it, they need help, right? They need our help. Now, we're not looking at necessarily all the arms help, like, because we kind of see that maybe that wasn't working so well. So it's a different type of help. It's going to be the big boys have to come in, help. Like you got to go in and help this poor little victim from the bully. That's what they're trying to plant in you now. and it's going to be like getting NATO expanded, or bringing Ukraine into NATO or the EU. You see, so that this is their new tactic. So you have to be aware always, like, what are they doing, with this propaganda. And one other, a way of looking at all this is that it's the truth. And, they're on the Zelensky Titanic. It's sinking rapidly, and Biden included. And there's a lifeboat there, and it's like, get off this Ukraine winning Titanic, and and there's the lifeboat's called Lifeboat of Truth. And, you could save your reputation a little bit if you get in that thing sooner rather than later. Okay, so there's different ways of looking at this, but I do think the overriding goal is to get support for Ukraine from the United States to come in there. You see. Now, if this is the case, and I'm right, this is another very escalatory development. And that is this plays into that military-industrial complex. This plays into the Mitt Romney and Adam Kinzinger, that the United States has to go in there directly confront Russia in Ukraine to save Ukraine from the bully. You see how that all plays out? This is sort of one of their strategies, I believe, that they're up to. So, moving on to other escalatory events. You have this United States giving missiles to Ukraine, and then they brought in the longer range missiles that can go deeper into Russia or Crimea. And then, you had Biden flip-flopping a little bit. Now, you're seeing Biden flip-flopping a little bit because he's a poll guy. He has no values. You see, like, when you look over his career, you see he was basically more, I'm just being open here and honest. He was more of a racist. I mean, he was the guy who gave the eulogy for Robert Byrd, as a KKK Klansman. And, you heard a lot of words dropped by Biden. I mean, there's no hiding it. And then you see him now. Okay, so you tell me all of a sudden he had this big change of heart like in 2020, or do you think the real person was really still really there? Yeah, I don't see an 80-year-old guy all of a sudden coming to terms with all this and the complete changing. You see what I'm saying? I mean, I think this guy is basically just. He's an empty suit, and he just goes wherever the wind blows to gain public favor. So Biden sees his polls tanking. In the beginning, he went along with all this because he really thought that he was going to pull out this victory. They convinced him that throw down all these sanctions. That would later, end up wrecking Europe and coming back and, devastating the economy of the United States. I mean, look at the stock markets. And, he thought that he was going to be the rock star, like a new JFK. They were going to have the big ticker tape parade for him beating Russia, and they found out that now he's handed a huge political loss. And his polls are lower than they've ever been. He's actually the lowest polling president ever. And, it completely backfired. And he's trying to maybe distance himself a little bit from all this. So he told some of his, his cabal in the White House, to cool the rhetoric down a little bit. Then, he's some of his advisors are probably telling him now he needs to think about negotiating. So this is where you have like Sullivan, come out and say, oh yeah, we need to negotiate with Russia. But then their actions are something completely different. So they're just saying that to appease, Biden because he's like demented and everything. But the real agenda is to plow forward, full speed with this whole, escalation. And then, you have Lloyd Austin and the rest of the cabal all completely on board with getting a war going. Now, whether the whole Pentagon is behind this, I don't think so, to be honest. I think that we're seeing kind of a semi-muted response from like the Pentagon, other than helping out how they have to. So anyway, going back to this this whole thing with the missiles in Ukraine. Now, you know, Arestovich and the rest of this gangster regime are already talking about, you know, firing these missiles once they get them, like into Russia and into Crimea. And you know, this is going to be a huge escalation in this war. So you could see there's no intention by the ones who are controlling Ukraine. Okay, Zelensky's a puppet. He's under control of the United States. Or the cabal who's really running the Biden administration. There's no desire to quiet this thing down. In fact, it's full steam ahead. And they want a full-on world war. Okay? As crazy as that sounds, everything points to that. All right. Now, another thing I alluded to before is that you've got this NATO official. He's like the Assistant Secretary General of NATO, okay? Came out planting these ideas that a sovereign country can decide for itself whether they want to deploy nuclear weapons on their territory. Basically, a country could decide if they want to allow the United States to put nuclear weapons there. That's what they're getting down to. And now, of course, they say, oh, yes, this is included with our NATO, alliance, But, no, what they're trying to do is plant that seed that a country has that right. Okay? Now, can you think back to like the Cuban Missile Crisis and whether Cuba would have had that right to decide for itself, and everyone would have to respect that right? Okay? See, this is what they're basically trying to get in people's heads. That's a country's decision. Like, why would it matter if it was NATO or not? You see what I mean? So this is how they work it. They they're very clever on doing these tactics. And then notice something else right after that. Now, keep in mind, this is all after Turkey denied with a veto of fast-tracking Finland and Sweden into NATO, okay? So you could see how, they're scheming another way of getting at Russia. And then you have later, a couple days after that, you have Poland coming out, an ex-foreign minister, saying, yes, we should allow Ukraine the right to deploy nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Okay? See, this is just another extension of that argument. That now it's the right of the, sovereign country Ukraine now, which is hardly a sovereign country, to have that decision of having nuclear weapons in it. See how dangerous all this is? Now, if that would happen, there's no doubt you're looking at another World War III. So you see all these players involved with this, and these decisions are trying to bring a world war. I mean, these people are psychopaths. So meanwhile, you have the United States embarking on this very destructive foreign policy. I don't think anyone would argue much that what's happening, throughout the world on a foreign policy level with the United States has been horrendous. Whether it's China, India, look at the coup attempt they initiated in Pakistan, on and on. The whole Middle East, it's a disaster. There's nothing going for the United States foreign policy at all. Well, on the other hand, you see what Russia's doing. they're going around strengthening economic ties between all its allies. As Belarus are going, all to the stands over to China. Lavrov is traveling all over the world, strengthening ties, and they're solidifying alliances. They're also building sort of these networks of trading routes. They've set up their Mir system. It's like a SWIFT system. So, I mean, they're moving leaps and bounds, especially with the Chinese. So you see like this destruction of a foreign policy by the United States, and you see, a successful foreign policy being implemented by Russia. And again, you have to ask yourself, is this all by design? Okay. And then you look at, the situation with China. I mean, this could not be worse and at a worse time for the United States, where, you saw that disastrous visit, to the East by Biden, where he had, all the gaffes, and, he mentioned, going in to defend Taiwan, and China, lashed out, and then, and then the White House had to walk it back. And basically, they had to completely appease, China. And you've got, North Korea fired a barrage of missiles, and a lot of statements by, the Asian countries. It's a very negative visit. There is nothing good that came out of that. And Taiwan wants to improve relationships with Russia and do $10 billion worth of trade with them. And I mean, things are just falling apart, especially in Asia for the United States. So you've got this rhetoric and escalations, with this whole China-Taiwan thing. And this thing could just spill over, it could just happen at any time. You can tell China's ready. They're ready, and they don't even care anymore. They're not holding back on anything. They're not holding anything back. And in fact, I think it's the opposite. I think they're waiting for a reason to just take Taiwan. They're at their wits' end. They're so they've been, I think, in their minds, they've been putting up with Biden. And you just think back to a couple of years ago, and try to compare how China was with the United States and how China is acting now. Look at Saudi Arabia. Look at India, completely dissed. This is really unprecedented. This has never happened before. You have a collapse of foreign policy by the United States. This should be sounding alarm bells, in Washington. I mean, this should be all over, the news. What's happening? This is a complete collapse of confidence in this administration on every level. And the thing that should be going on every single night, if this was really true open media, it would be about, what are they going to do about this administration? This has got to end. This administration, it's worse than, I mean, you heard what's going on back in Nixon time when they were trying to, after Watergate, trying to figure out what to do with that. This is way worse. It's incomparable. So things are collapsing here in the United States. And I think that really, when you look at everything I've just been telling you, the obvious conclusion is that this is done by design. And I keep on bringing this up because this is so significant. Because if this is done by design, and all this escalating is going on by design, where is that going to lead us? If it's done by design, that means these people are psychopaths. They want a war. And is there going to be a mere conventional war going on? Do you think that this is going to can, like expand from like Ukraine to and include Poland? Or I mean, do you really think that it's going to be localized? Like Poland wants territorial claims on Ukraine, and this is being egged on by Czechoslovakia or the Czech government. So what would happen if Poland sees things getting really bad with this war and just says, oh, we want to exert our territorial claims? And of course, what do you think the Ukraine government's going to do? It's going to be like, yeah, sure, because their country's going to be collapsing. It sure is better to be part of Poland than to be part of Russia. Okay, so then what happens? Then you got Polish troops in Western Ukraine. Okay, and then is that NATO now? Of course. So I mean, you can see how this can escalate so quickly, and there's not going to be a one country of NATO involved in this war and not the others. So we know that if this spills over, it spills over big, right? Okay, and then you know that NATO in most of these countries is incapable of defending against Russia. Like, look at the Baltic states. I mean, Russia could just literally like walk into those countries. There's very little defense capabilities of any of those countries. So what happens then? Well, I think you know where a war would go if NATO and Russia were to go at it. It's not going to be conventional. It's going to escalate up into, a lot of missile attacks, aviation strikes. It's going to be the United States. And it's going to end up going, tactical nukes. It's not going to be contained. That's what I'm getting at. It will never be contained. And then what do you think China's going to do if it sees all that going on? Well, China's got its interest too. So you can see this could easily go global. This could go World War III. And this, in my opinion, is being egged on. So again, this is just, my thoughts on where all this is going or could go. And, we really need to watch all these escalations because any one of these things, I just mentioned a few of them. There's several others. All it takes is one of these things to go awry. What happens if Turkey is not working on behalf of Russia on these things too? Because, I already gave you 3 examples of how Turkey is helping Russia. What about if they flip back? Or what happens if one of these longer range missiles hits the Crimea Bridge, the longest bridge in Europe that Russia recently completed? I mean, what happens if a missile somehow gets into Russia that hits Moscow? Or hits another ship in their Black Sea fleet? They're bringing in Harpoon missiles. On the latest list of weapons that are coming into Ukraine, you have Denmark giving Harpoon missiles. You have Netherlands giving Neptune anti-ship missiles. And the United States is giving Harpoon missiles in their last package. So, I mean, you can see how it's not going to take much. Now, we're all in this normalcy bias where everyone is sort of gotten used to this war. And when you look at this Johnny Depp trial, it had 8 times more people following that than the Ukrainian war. So people are used to the war now. They're like, the frogs that are getting slowly boiled. And people are adjusting to the danger. Whereas the reality is the danger has never been higher than it is right now.